In 2019, Free League dropped something that would excite a lot of Alien fans like myself, the official Alien role-playing game. Designed by the head of the company, Thomas Harenstam, the game excelled in relatively simple mechanics and a focus on psychological horror and survival. Since its initial release, Free League has supported the game with a pretty respectable lineup of supplements. These include a trilogy of adventures, a Colonial Marines Operations Manual, and a Colonial Management supplement called Building Better Worlds, all of which I've covered on this channel. I've run and played this game plenty of times using the original rule set, experiencing all the best and worst parts of the rules, and in the end, I have to conclude that the game is quite serviceable. But with the release of the second edition called Alien Evolved in 2025, everything got a little bit better. In this video, I'm going to break down as many of the rules changes as I could identify, and you'll find that the changes not only justify the Evolved title, but remind us exactly why Free League continues to be one of the most loved tabletop RPG publishers today. First, before we jump in, I want to mention the revised layout. I could probably do a whole video on this, but I'll keep it relatively short. Basically, one of the biggest complaints about the first edition of the game was how the white on black pages were kind of hard to read and very punishing to print at home. They tapped Johan Nohr of Morkborg fame to redo the layout, and ironically, the guy who was responsible for creating an enduring trend in Skater Mag, ultra messy, 3 random fonts per page layout for RPGs actually went ahead and made Alien extremely readable and usable. I think step one for him was to invert all of the colors so that black became white and white became black. Then he generally packed the pages with text, closing the gap between Free League's luxurious minimalist spreads and more traditional RPG presentations that have lots of huge text blocks. And he tackled one issue that shows up in virtually all Year Zero engine core rulebooks from Free League, which is character archetype pages not spelling out the unique talents. The actual talents are defined right there on the same page. And he also added some really beautiful little additions like flowcharts that explain the mechanics in a few places. All in all, this layout is way better for reading, referencing, and actually using. Oh, also there's the character sheet. This is maybe the most important layout improvement to the whole product. It's printer friendly, it's logically organized and easy to read and scan, and it pulls off that sort of dystopian corporate bureaucratic paperwork look. Johan and his team did a great job here. All right, let's get to the rules changes. Let's take a look at the single most important table in the game now, the thing that'll crop up in any and all sessions of Alien, and that is the stress response roll. It used to be that if you roll a 1 on a stress die, it would trigger a panic roll. 1 through 6 on this table were null results, and 7 and higher, numbers which are attained when you add your current stress level to a d6 panic roll, have all kinds of entries that represent really dramatic, scene-changing personal breakdowns, increasing in intensity. The Evolved Edition still has this table, but you're now meant to roll on it only in those extremely stressful situations also listed in the previous version, but notably, not every time you roll a 1 on a stress die. In the Evolved Edition, when you roll a 1 on one of these stress dice, you consult this stress response roll table. You use this table by rolling a d6 and adding your current stress level as before, but now you reduce that sum by your current resolve score, which is this new attribute that you derive from adding your wits and your empathy score and dividing by 2, rounding up. So the end result is that instead of constantly slipping into a scene-altering panic response, you're probably just going to suffer a roll penalty that will require some downtime or medication to remove. This ultimately has the effect of reducing the frequency of those silly moments created by the panic table and increasing the feeling of desperation born of failed rolls. It's worth noting that even with the panic table in the Evolved Edition, you're going to reduce your roll by your resolve stat, which will help to reduce the chance of a silly panic moment even when you do have to roll on this table. In our playthrough of these new rules, we found that the resolve stat really helped to balance out the combat effectiveness of medic and scientist type characters who typically have more wits and empathy and less in the other stats, which means they had a higher resolve. In other words, resolve is a way to make wits and empathy more important in the game. The other interesting thing that we noticed was that once your stress levels get high enough, you'll find that you're constantly rolling lots of stress dice and pretty frequently rolling on this stress response table. And if left unchecked, you'll be hitting this last entry on the table, which negates all successes on a roll and adds even more stress. So it's a pretty diabolical table that ramps up pretty nicely as long as the GM is running the game properly by continuously throwing threats at the players. Alright, combat. The most notable change in combat for me personally has been how the ranged attack works. Since this is Alien, there are usually guns or flamethrowers, and ranged attacks are pretty common, so they put some polish on ranged attacks. First of all, there's now a dodge mechanic. The target doesn't have to dodge, but if they do, then that triggers an opposed combat versus mobility roll between attacker and target. Each success rolled by the target cancels out an attacker's success. And check this out, in the first edition, you only rolled to see if a point of ammo was expended if you rolled a 1 on a panic die when rolling for the attack. But in Evolved, you are more likely to make an ammo roll every time you fire the weapon. The only time you avoid the ammo roll is if you roll an extra success and spend it to conserve ammo rather than use that extra success to add it as extra damage. If you decide to or have to make that ammo roll, it's a D6, and on a 1, ammo for that weapon is reduced by 1. There's also a notable change to armor in the Evolved edition. In the first edition, armor works by rolling the number of dice equal to your armor rating. Any 6s that you roll lowers incoming damage by 1. By contrast, in Evolved, when there is incoming damage, the armor level just reduces incoming damage by whatever the armor rating is. It's a flat given reduction every time. So personnel armor, for example, would reduce incoming armor by 2 every single time without any rolls. The only exceptions to this are armor-piercing attacks, which will permanently degrade armor effectiveness by 1 point per attack, and a special attack where you declare that you're aiming for a weak spot, which puts a -2 on that attack, but on a hit will also permanently reduce armor by 1 point. This weak spot penalty can actually be negated by the taking aim quick action, and just as a word of advice, you're going to want to combine the weak spot with the taking aim up front in any Xeno fight in order to whittle down their armor. I think they took a page from the Traveler RPG, which always had this legendary life path system that you can use at character creation, and it's a nice touch here. You can generate the core stats and backstory for your character now, all by rolling on a series of tables. First, you roll a 2d6 to see if you're a human or android. You're only an android on an 11 or 12. Then you roll for your origin. I wouldn't say that a lot of these so-called supernations are particularly well defined or developed in this book, but this setting backdrop stuff is really not the point of the game. It is nice to have at least a few details here. And there are roles related to your career leading up to your current misadventure, all of which contribute toward your final stats. There were a couple of major sources of pain that I was hoping to see addressed in this second edition of the game, and I ended up not getting any satisfaction on those two fronts. The first was more sophisticated or nuanced mechanics around playing a synth or android. The core advantages of playing a synth are that you start off with higher core stats than a human, and you're not subject to stress or panic rolls. You can also withstand the vacuum of space, and you don't have to eat, drink, or breathe. The main drawback is that you can't push rolls or accumulate stress dice that can juice your rolls. What this ends up being is a pretty flat experience for the player, where they're relatively high powered, but they're cut off from two major, constantly present mechanics in the game, that of pushing rolls and rolling on the stress and panic tables. I wasn't able to find any changes or modifications to the synth rules in this newer version, which is fine actually. I made a whole video full of suggested rules that can make your synth play experience a lot more interesting, and formalized it all into a document that you can get from my Patreon. I've also playtested some of these alternate rules and they work great. The other big pain point to the original rules was the ship combat. The only meaningful change that they made in the new edition that I could see was that they added a commander dice roll at the beginning of each round of ship combat, which can confer a bonus success to another crew member's roll on that round. But they're not called rounds in ship combat anymore, they're stretches. I actually wrote a whole explanation of how ship combat is abysmal in this game on my newsletter, and you can read that for free if you want. But generally, I'd just say that you should avoid ship combat in this game if you can. It's not a setting built for ship-to-ship combat, and I don't think you should try and force it. I've had a lot of exposure to the Alien RPG this year, mostly because I really liked the show that came out, Alien Earth, and I think there was all this hype about the new edition here that we discussed in this video. In the end, I think the game does a better job than ever of delivering a thematic, Alien the movie one-shot experience where you're trapped on a ship or a station, sneaking around and occasionally encountering a deadly space beast. Everything is on brand in that regard. I think where the game does not appear to shine is in longer term play. The hope is that maybe you can extend the game outwards to include more involved factional play, intrigue, politics, or some other conceits that require a long game. But there are two reasons why that just wouldn't work very well. The first is your skills. Take a look at these skills. They're just engineered around a specific type of experience, that of surviving in the short term against a mysterious and deadly threat in a closed environment. And second is the stress and panic system, which is also entirely geared towards short-term immediate spikes in danger and psychological trauma. I think some of us found ourselves wanting to play this game in a longer and more involved campaign scenario because we love the Alien universe so much. We're fans of it, but the fact is, we as players can only encounter Xenos and facehuggers and their relatively minor variations for only so long before it starts to get old. Yes, the PCs will have seen these creatures only for the first time and they're surprised and all that, but the players are the opposite of surprised. And Free League has not expressed any plans to put out a bestiary that provides enough different other bestial threats in order to make this game a better long-term play prospect. Which is all to say, Alien is better than ever, but it's a game you're not going to find yourself playing for years. It's a specially engineered experience that claims to have campaign play, but it's probably more like extended multi-shots at best, which is fine. Not all games need to support years-long campaigns. Alien Evolved is excellent for what it is and what it's trying to do, except for ship combat. You'll still want to avoid that. That's all I've got for now. Let me know your thoughts on Alien RPG and the rules changes in Evolved down in the comments. Links are below. Thanks for watching. I'll see ya.